While comic book adaptations are often seen as guaranteed hits, especially in today's market, many films based on graphic novels consistently underperform. Secondary-tier comics tend to struggle the most. They don't have the luxury of $200 million budgets or massive built-in fan bases, making it much harder for them to break through. Yet, studios keep investing in them, believing that a comic book adaptation has a better shot at success than an original action or sci-fi film with no established source material. Today, let's take a look at a few adaptations that failed to connect with audiences and ultimately flopped at the box office, some more spectacularly than others. The story of Spawn's production is something of a Cinderella tale, except this one never made it to the ball. In the mid-1990s, when New Line Cinema greenlit the project, the filmmakers initially courted some of Hollywood's biggest names. Even director Tim Burton showed interest, and with Burton in the mix, Danny DeVito also flirted with the idea of joining the film. At the time, Spawn was expected to have a sizable budget, at least by mid-1990s standards. Will Smith was also briefly attached to the project, drawn to the script, but ultimately opting for Men in Black instead. According to Smith, he worried that playing such a dark, brooding character would clash with his image as a charismatic, wisecracking everyman. Once Smith walked away, Burton followed, and DeVito quickly lost interest as well. With their departure, the studio drastically slashed the film's budget, forcing the production to look toward smaller names. They reached out to actors like Denzel Washington and even Snoop Dogg, but financial constraints prevented any deals from being made. That left only one actor still willing to take on the role, Wesley Snipes. His career had already begun to stall, but he was still considered a major star at the time. Snipes had his sights set on securing a franchise. Even though comic book adaptations weren't a guaranteed success in those years, that didn't deter him. Spawn was originally planned as a small, dark film with a budget of $20 to $25 million. Production was already gearing up when Blade came into the picture. According to producer Todd McFarlane, it all came down to money. Blade was immediately given a budget of $40 to $45 million, while Spawn was capped at 25 at best. Looking back, one could argue that Snipes' departure may have accelerated the decline of his Hollywood career. After he walked away, the lead role went to Michael Jai White. Not exactly a major star, but still a recognizable name. The director's chair went to Japanese filmmaker Mark A.X. Dippe. With a $25 million budget, the film moved into production. The first footage sent back to the studio impressed everyone. New Line Cinema was so thrilled with what they saw that they added another $15 million to enhance the film's visual effects. Additionally, the studio granted the filmmakers full creative control, completely loosening the reins. This decision would later frustrate Michael Jai White. According to him, the first act of the film was originally meant to be more grounded and dramatic, but once New Line Cinema approved the bigger budget and allowed for more special effects, everything changed. Many scenes were reshot. Michael Jai White has openly stated that he wasn't happy about it, as the set was pure chaos. More often than not, he had no idea what they were filming or where certain scenes even came from in the script. White is frequently quoted as speaking positively about the film, but in interviews he consistently emphasizes that he doesn't like Spawn and has never called it a good movie. When the studio finally received a full rough cut of the film, their initial excitement noticeably faded, and when Spawn was sent to the ratings board and came back with an adult rating, the decision was made to trim it down to secure a more teen-friendly theatrical release. Later, an unrated director's cut with the original adult rating would be released on home video. At the box office, Spawn had a surprisingly strong opening. In its first week of U.S. release, it pulled in $21 million. Among the top 20 films, it trailed only Air Force One in per-screen earnings. Thanks to this promising start, the film even expanded to more theaters in its second week. However, instead of maintaining momentum, Spawn quickly lost its audience. Within just 2 weeks, it ranked among the worst performers in the top 10, leading theaters to cut its screen count in half. As a result, it plummeted to the middle of the second tier, where it ultimately sank. By the end of its worldwide run, Spawn grossed $87 million against a budget of $40. While not a complete disaster, it was far from a hit. A sequel might have still been possible if not for the overwhelmingly poor reception from both critics and audiences. In some countries, Spawn holds an average rating of around 7, which is close to the level of a very good film. However, in the US, its audience score sits at about 5, a rating typically reserved for a very bad movie. Had the situation been reversed, a sequel might have actually happened. The original plan included 2 follow-ups, both intended for theatrical release in 1998 and 1999. Rumors suggest that studio executives were deeply disappointed with the final product, especially after granting the filmmakers full creative control and nearly doubling the initial budget. A Spawn reboot continues to surface in entertainment news even today. Jamie Foxx was originally set to take on the lead role, with production first promised for 2018, then 2019, before all updates quietly stopped. It remains unclear whether the reboot will ever see the light of day, or if, in another 10 years, we'll simply hear about it again with a whole new cast. However, as of now, both Jamie Foxx and Jeremy Renner are still attached, and the project is officially considered alive. Unlike Spawn, which came together without much trouble, The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen was a completely different story. Director Stephen Norrington signed on for the project, even turning down the Blade sequel to make it happen, a decision he would later deeply regret. According to Norrington, working on The League was the worst experience of his life. Not only did the producers and the studio breathe down his neck, controlling his every move on set, but Sean Connery constantly gave him lessons on how to do his job. Connery was one of those rare actors who remained a superstar even at 70 years old. He was paid $17 million for The League, making him the highest paid person on set, and the only one the studio consistently listened to during production. Sean Connery openly admitted that he never wanted to be in The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. He didn't understand the script and thought it was complete nonsense. However, by the late 1990s and early 2000s, Connery had already turned down several major projects that went on to become massive hits. The Matrix was one of them. He rejected it simply because he found the script too bizarre. So when another unconventional film landed on his desk, he decided to take a gamble. He no longer trusted his instincts when picking scripts, realizing he couldn't keep up with the evolving industry. But while Connery was willing to tolerate the script, he had no patience for the film's director. According to the cast and crew, Connery was relentless when it came to criticizing anyone he felt wasn't doing their job properly. And most of his frustration was directed at the director. Jason Fleming, who played one of the supporting roles, recalled that filming was frequently interrupted by Connery's booming voice tearing into someone. And since his voice carried an air of authority, even when he was berating the director, everyone on set acted like school children caught misbehaving, eyes down, afraid to move. Yet director Stephen Norrington refused to back down, pushing back against Connery's complaints at every turn. This only escalated tensions, leading Connery to unleash a string of expletives so creative that many on set had never heard anything like them before. Later, Stephen Norrington refused to participate in any promotional events for the film and announced his departure from the industry altogether. At one of the film's premiere screenings, a journalist asked Sean Connery where the director was. Connery simply shrugged and suggested checking the nearest mental institution. As if the production hadn't suffered enough, The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen was also hit by one of the most devastating floods in the history of the Czech Republic. Nearly $10 million worth of sets were destroyed in the disaster. Naturally, the studio was horrified by the situation, and much of the remaining footage had to be heavily trimmed. After disastrous test screenings, nearly 40 minutes of material was cut, leaving the theatrical release with a runtime of just 1 hour and 50 minutes. On top of everything else, The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen had the worst possible luck with its release date. The film opened on the same day as Pirates of the Caribbean: The Curse of the Black Pearl. By the time it became clear that Gore Verbinski's Pirates was one of the biggest blockbusters of 2003, it was far too late to change anything. In nearly every country, The League was released either just before Pirates or immediately after, leaving it with no real chance of survival. To make matters worse, the film was torn apart by critics. American audiences received it slightly better than Spawn, but even then, an average rating of around 6 out of 10 was far from reassuring. At first glance, The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen's box office numbers might have sparked hope for a sequel. With a budget of $78 million, the film grossed $179 million worldwide. However, once marketing costs were factored in, the studio was clearly in the red. Even so, the financial damage could have been softened through home video sales and television rights. Most often, the film's lack of a sequel is attributed to its poor reception from both critics and audiences. However, one crucial factor is often overlooked: Sean Connery's departure. Following the film's release, Connery announced that he no longer understood Hollywood and that it was time for him to retire. His exit may have been the true death blow to a potential sequel, rather than the lukewarm reviews. Although the film's ending allowed for a continuation without him, it still hinted that, under the right circumstances, Connery might return. But greenlighting a sequel to an already divisive film without its biggest star would have been a gamble only the boldest risk-takers would dare to make. As for director Stephen Norrington, while he initially walked away from filmmaking, it seems he later had a change of heart. His name has surfaced multiple times in connection with various long gestating projects, The Crow, Akira, and others, yet each time he eventually stepped away. So far, his comeback has yet to materialize. However, at just 57 years old, there's no real obstacle preventing his return, at least in theory. Jonah Hex is one of those puzzling films that seem to have no audience. Not even its own studio cared about it by the time it was released, and yet during its early development things didn't look so bleak. Initially, Matthew McConaughey showed interest in the project, but negotiations over his salary fell through. Then, director Mark Neveldine, riding high after the success of Crank, came on board. However, creative differences with the studio led to his departure, and the script went through multiple rewrites. Eventually, Josh Brolin signed on for the lead role, but only after demanding several more revisions, as he found the script incredibly weak. Once those changes were made, Megan Fox joined the cast, still at the peak of her fame thanks to Transformers. Actor Jimmy Hayward, best known for the animated film Horton Hears a Who, was brought on to helm the project. However, once all these talented people presented Jonah Hex to a test audience, it became painfully clear that the film in its current state was simply unwatchable. Warner Brothers scrambled to salvage the situation, rounding up the cast for extensive reshoots. Entire storylines were scrapped, replaced with new ones hastily conceived by Hayward himself. The month-long fix drastically altered much of the film and ballooned the budget from $35 to $47 million. Unfortunately, despite the studio's efforts, test screenings still yielded the same verdict. Audiences remained unimpressed and felt the film wasn't ready for release. By this point, it was clear that Jonah Hex was beyond saving, and the studio essentially dumped it into theaters with little to no marketing support. Later, Josh Brolin candidly referred to Jonah Hex as a terrible movie, but emphasized that both the cast and director gave it their all. No one wanted it to turn out the way it did. Megan Fox was even more blunt, calling it the worst film of her career. At the box office, Jonah Hex sank without a trace. Despite a budget of $47 million, it managed to earn only $10 million in the US, making it one of the most disastrous comic book adaptations of its time. A week after its release, Jonah Hex held the worst per-theater average among the 50 films playing in US cinemas. In many countries, it was quietly pulled from release schedules and sent straight to video. Adding insult to injury, Jonah Hex later picked up 2 Golden Raspberry nominations. There likely would have been more, but the film was so irrelevant that only Josh Brolin and Megan Fox, its most recognizable names, were singled out. The Hellboy reboot had a difficult road, much like the entire franchise centered around the demon hero. The first film, directed by Guillermo del Toro in 2004, was a complete box office failure. It was only saved by strong reviews from critics and audiences, along with impressive home media sales, which convinced the studio to greenlight a sequel 4 years later. However, the second installment also struggled to achieve significant box office success, even if it didn't flop as hard as the first. Despite solid reviews for Hellboy 2, its performance on television and home video apparently wasn't strong enough to justify a third film, leaving the planned trilogy unfinished. There are numerous conflicting rumors surrounding the fate of Hellboy. According to one version, Guillermo del Toro insisted on a $100 million budget for the third film and refused to settle for anything less. Another version suggests that Hellboy creator Mike Mignola wanted del Toro to change the direction of the franchise and relinquish more creative creative control, something the director was unwilling to do. Ultimately, in 2019, a reboot was released with a $50 million budget, a completely new cast, Neil Marshall in the director's chair, and Mignola having far greater creative influence. Unlike the first two films, this version also carried an R rating. David Harbour, who played the lead role in the Hellboy reboot, believes that die-hard fans of Guillermo del Toro's version were the reason behind the film's massive failure. According to him, the backlash was overwhelming from the start, creating a negative buzz that had little to do with the actual quality of the movie. Over time, this negativity only grew stronger, scaring off casual audiences who might have enjoyed the film. Released in April 2019, Hellboy bombed at the box office. With a $50 million budget, it barely scraped together $55 million worldwide. And while its audience scores weren't as disastrous as Jonah Hex, the film still earned 5 Golden Raspberry nominations. In 2023, the studio decided to revive The Guy from Hell once again, allocating a hefty $20 million for the operation. The film's title almost felt like a hint at the fate of the franchise. It was released in mid-2024, and as expected, the budget was barely enough for an exhumation. While a few true enthusiasts wrote some positive reviews, fans cast their votes at the box office. The movie pulled in just $1,300,000. Hellboy showed no signs of life, but given how relentlessly the studio keeps pushing the Hellboy cart down the tracks of the film industry, it's safe to say the franchise's biggest fans might still be sitting inside the studio itself. And who knows, this might not be their last attempt to bring the devil back from the depths. The new Judge Dredd was crafted with die-hard fans of the original comic in mind. Unlike the 1995 film starring Sylvester Stallone, which was widely rejected by the comic's fanbase. And judging by critic and audience scores, the filmmakers succeeded in winning them over. However, the film's production was far from smooth. Officially directed by Pete Travis, known for Vantage Point, the script was penned by Alex Garland, whose writing credits include Sunshine, The Beach, and 28 Days Later. According to Carl Urban, who played Dredd, it was actually Garland who oversaw most of the filming, while Travis focused more on pre-production and, as Urban put it, shooting sunrises. The filmmakers made it clear from the start that they were distancing themselves from Stallone's Judge Dredd, and they emphasized this at every opportunity. Yet, despite their best efforts, traces of Sly's Dredd still lingered in the film, whether they intended it or not. This was largely due to Alex Garland, who was involved from the project's earliest stages and played a key role in getting it greenlit. Additionally, most of the producers had previously worked with Garland on The Beach 28 weeks later and would later collaborate with him on Ex Machina. Perhaps this was also why Duncan Jones ultimately passed on directing Dredd, opting instead for source code. While Jones admitted he liked the script, he recognized that Garland had full creative control over the film, and under those conditions, he felt he wouldn't be able to work freely. Though Pete Travis turned a blind eye to most of it, he occasionally voiced his disagreements with Garland's decisions on set. However, whenever he did, he was simply asked to step aside and let the adults do their job. As a result, Travis had no involvement in the editing process, and post-production was entirely handled by Alex Garland himself. Travis's departure was officially attributed to the ever-familiar excuse of creative differences. All these issues hurt the film, and its test screenings didn't go well, forcing the studio to order reshoots. This time, Garland handled them entirely on his own, leading many in Hollywood to assume that Pete Travis would ultimately be removed from the film's directing credits, with Garland's name taking his place. However, the Directors Guild was convinced that the changes were minor and that the final product was still Travis's film. Everyone else, it seemed, had merely been filming crumbling plaster. In the US, the film's failure was nothing short of catastrophic. With a budget of $50 million, Dredd managed to scrape together only $13 million at the box office. Within a week of its release, it had already slipped into the second tier of the charts, and by the following week it had plummeted to 33rd place, where it promptly vanished without a trace. Naturally, the planned 33 sequels, 2 spin-offs, and 4 prequels were immediately scrapped, and the producers pretended the film had never existed. The only person who still brings up Dredd is Carl Urban, who has repeatedly claimed that a sequel is just around the corner and that progress is finally being made. Then, as expected, the film magically transforms into a much better TV series, which apparently everyone is on board to make until, inevitably, all these discussions amount to nothing. That said, Dredd does have its own fan base, and it's not exactly small. In theory, a movie or series could still happen one day, but if a few more years pass, the more likely outcome is yet another reboot. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss the next episodes. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned.